we gotta talk about something really important. Armor in role-playing games. Alright, so there are different ways of doing armor in role-playing systems, obviously. The simplest way is to just assign an armor rating and treat that as damage absorption. Then, of course, there's different damage types, which some systems do. So you have slashing, piercing, and crushing or blunt damage, usually. So the essential question here, and probably the reason why you're watching this right now instead of working, is how does this relate to real life? I'm just going to barge in on myself to thank today's sponsor helping out with the channel, Raid Shadow Legends. This is a game for those who like fantasy the same way as flavorful coffee. Dark, roasted, sensual. Okay, coffee is great, but not as good as booze. Anyway, the protagonists are killed off right in the intro. That's pretty edgy. So there's a collection RPG, which is free to play, and this has been downloaded by almost 10 million players worldwide. You can collect over 400 champions from 16 factions. It's got a story campaign, PvP arenas, clans. Personally, I like the collecting aspect of it with all the different character designs. At the same time, if you don't have much time for gaming, you can just jump in here and there and play for a quick session. And there's a rewards program for new players, so you got a daily reward login for the first 90 days. So click the special links in the video description down below to try it out. That also gives you 50,000 silver and a free epic champion as a new player bonus. So there's certain basic armor types which absorb more or less of a particular kind of damage. Textile armor can be either some padding in the form of wool or felt or animal hair or who knows what between layers of fabric usually, or it can be a large number of fabric layers combined, either stitched together, quilted, or sometimes with glue in between. So that's generally best against blunt or crushing impact because it can compress and absorb some of the force. Then we've got flexible metal armor. Could be mail, could be some forms of scale. These interlocking iron or steel rings are best against cuts because you just won't be able to penetrate that with an edge. Sometimes you see tests done with poorly made butted mail where the rings are just bent closed instead of riveted, or poor quality rings, or whatever. And then you can do some damage, but just slicing straight through, it's not going to happen. This is pretty much cut proof. Not so good against blunt impact though. And piercing is sort of in between. It can protect against piercing damage, but only to an extent. And then you have semi-flexible hard metal armors, like this brigandine here, which has overlapping steel plates under the fabric layer. So these do move and flex to an extent, not as much as mail. So something like this would be excellent against slashing damage because it forms a metal barrier that the blade can't just pass through. And it would also be better against piercing than mail because it's more rigid. So it's going to give to an extent, but at a certain point it'll most likely stop the thrust unless it's powerful enough to actually pierce one of the steel plates. And it's also better against blunt damage because it dissipates the force over larger areas of solid metal. Doesn't absorb quite as much as padding, but it's actually pretty decent at that. And then you have fully rigid armor like these steel gauntlets. So there you have a solid plate that stops any attempt at cutting through it, obviously, that stops piercing attacks, and that is also pretty good against blunt damage. So here's the problem for balance purposes in role-playing games, which is of course way more important than any realism consideration. This is arguably the best kind of armor, just in terms of protectiveness. It is the most protective, period. It has other issues, like cost, for example, heat, mobility. You're not going to be quite as flexible and quite as nimble as without armor, but it doesn't really limit you as much as one might think if it's well made and properly fitted to the user. It can actually perform quite well. However, this is a lot of weight added to you, so it will be much more exhausting to move in. And then, of course, there's the issue that it can be very vulnerable to piercing damage. Just in a different way. Not this kind of head-on, I'm going to stab through your metal plate, but it can circumvent it, because you're always going to have some gaps in the armor. In this case, gauntlets, you cannot have solid plates on the inside where the palm is. Why? Because then you couldn't move the hand anymore. You couldn't close your hand. You tried with segmented plates, but it would still be very difficult to grab things properly. So you can get stabbed on the inside of the hand, which is actually shown in some of the historical manuals. And you can also get stabbed in any gaps, like under the arms, for example. You cannot have full plates under the arms, because again, then you cannot move the arms properly. There's always going to be openings, and those openings can be exploited with piercing attacks, which that you can't really do that very well in a role-playing game, not accurately at least, and not in any really purposeful way that wouldn't make it completely cluttered and a mess of tables and die rolls and all of that. Unless you want to do it as a specialized anti-armor technique that has a chance of bypassing the armor, or in case of critical hits, things like that. Okay, so it gets even more complicated than that. Different weapons don't have just one damage type in real life, if you want to apply that concept. And I'm not just talking about the obvious, like a warhammer like this, which can have crushing damage on one end and piercing damage on the other. That's a very obvious way, where you just switch between the two. There's also sort of hybrids, like an axe, for example. It can cut and sort of smash at the same time. And I've made a video about different types of cut, by the way, which I'm going to link down below. I'm not going to repeat that, because there is a difference between a chop, a slash, and a hew. But if you want to look that up, it's there. So in this case, you have quite a bit of blunt impact. Like this brigandine, for example, should hold up against an axe chop. I say should because it depends on the size of the axe and the strength of the wielder, of course. But it shouldn't just pass straight through for the most part. So it protects pretty well against the slashing aspect of it. But you still have just a blunt impact, because these are much more top heavy than a sword, and they hit harder than a sword. So just being struck with this very hard, again, the brigandine is going to dissipate some of that force, but this may still be enough to break bone underneath. This depends a lot on where you get hit. And this is a complication that you just can't purposefully do in a role-playing game. It would really depend on the type of weapon, the type of armor, and where you're being hit. For example, you could probably, if you're wearing a mail hauberk or a brigandine or scale armor, things like that, you could probably take a strike with an axe to the abdomen and be relatively okay, because you have natural padding, if you will. Depends on the size of your gut, of course, but your abdomen is able to compress a lot further than your rib cage, obviously. And there comes a certain threshold where there's enough blunt impact to rupture internal organs. Of course, we are squishy, but things can only stretch so far before they start to tear. Things like that. But generally, you will probably be okay. But if you took the same axe swing to the collarbone, that's probably going to pop. Or the shoulder, or the rib cage, something is probably going to break. As far as swords are concerned, it makes a huge difference what type. For example, if you have a rapier, they can cut. They're not great at it, but they can cut, and it's going to be a different kind of cut. So for a rapier to be effective, you do need to give it a bit of a drawing slash. And this is really mainly good against unarmored opponents. We won't cut through a Gearbest, for example, with a rapier. It's just not really happening. This is a pretty light hitter in terms of blunt impact. There's always going to be some element of blunt impact, of course. If you strike somebody as hard as you can with a rapier on clothing, it's going to hurt for sure. It's not going to be pleasant. But if they have any kind of padding, then this is basically mostly useless. However, in the thrust, the same thing will go right through textile armor, no problem. It doesn't matter what type of soft armor it is, if it's padded, or if it's a number of linen layers, for example, or if it's glued or not. Chances are this is going to go right through with a powerful thrust, because you've got all of that energy that you can deliver by putting your entire body weight into the thrust, lunging into it, and that's all concentrated on a small point. Not in this case because that's a practice rapier, but you have all that concentrated on a very small area on the point. It'll go right through. And then of course you have dedicated slashing blades like Japanese swords, which will generally make short work of textile armor because they're very good at separating the fibers and just slicing right in and just tearing the things wide open essentially, and also cutting the wear underneath. It's not going to be a whole lot of blunt impact. Then you have recurved blades like this, which are obscenely effective against soft targets because they basically draw the material in as they slice and they can penetrate pretty deeply. I found that this makes cutting through textile armor very, very easy. Forward curved blades like this kukuri are kind of hard to classify because they are a bit of a mix. Depending on the thickness of the blade and the weight, they can have a substantial heft and hit pretty hard in terms of blunt damage or crushing, but they can also slash and kind of slash pierce, because if you actually throw it forward like this and cut with the point leading, you can actually slash with the point itself, or you can throw it in such a way that it enters basically like a piercing action and then continues with a slash. So depending on how you use it, you can do more of a pierce, more of a slash, more of a slash pierce, whatever, or strike with the spine for just blunt impact, of course. Tip slashes against armor are pretty interesting because you can see it as almost more of an attack on the armor's durability rather than the wearer. Because if you throw a tip cut, it won't penetrate very far. Chances are it won't get far past the layers of cloth. And in fact, it might only scratch the user underneath or not even do anything at all, but it will tear stuff open. So it will do a lot of damage to the armor, not necessarily to the user underneath as much. This could also work to an extent on mail, because if you do this sort of tip strike, it may break rings open or just snap them in half or bend them enough that eventually you kind of tear holes into the metal fabric of the mail, and then you may have an opening. But yeah, this is very speculative, because in a fight it would be pretty difficult to consistently hit the same spot over and over again until you finally get through. So more likely you will just try to, against mail for example, you will just try to hit harder, just to impart more blunt impact, like more kinetic energy that is likely to cause internal bleeding or break bones and things like that. It's just simpler than trying to surgically dissect the armor, if you will. It makes for a pretty cool tactic for role-playing purposes, for dramatic effect, but it's not necessarily something that you could do that easily in an actual fight. And as far as piercing damage is concerned, you also have some variations. The simple form is something like a spike or a dagger or a rapier, a small sword, things like that. So something that you stab with directly, either downward or straight forward, and that'll of course go straight through. Again, fabric armor has a decent chance of making it through mail, especially if you have a fairly hefty piercing weapon that you can put your entire body weight behind, like a spear or a polearm. This will likely penetrate mail as well, and a lot of really medium grade armors, if you will, if you really deliver a powerful thrust. It gets pretty interesting and devastating when you have piercing and blunt damage combined. So you have a lot of momentum and kinetic energy concentrated at the end of a fairly narrow point. So this basically wrecks anything, really. It doesn't really matter what kind of armor it is. Soft armor, yeah, it might cushion the impact a little bit, but the spike will just tear through it and damage the wearer anyway. It will either tear through mail or just do enough blunt damage to the wearer underneath to break bones, etc. Things like brigandine, scale, again, even if it doesn't penetrate all the way, but chances are it will punch through the individual plates. But even if it doesn't, again, this is going to be a lot of impact. Against full plate, it will either punch a hole through it, depending on the thickness of the steel, or it will dent it substantially to where it becomes difficult to move in it. And if the head is struck, even a good helmet cannot absorb enough of the kinetic energy to prevent concussions, whiplash, brain hemorrhaging, etc. So arguably something like this is the best overall weapon in terms of just damage output. And I've done a number of tests with war picks and sickles, things like that, and it basically doesn't really matter what you put in front of it, it'll just tear through. When you're dealing with more beastly things like this larger two-handed version of an Igorot axe, you have a pierce, again, pretty small area, concentrates a lot of the force, but then it gets wider and wider and it rips the target open, essentially. Can have other drawbacks, of course, like getting stuck. But in terms of just raw damage output, I think it's pretty hard to beat something like this. And again, doesn't really matter what it is, doesn't matter if it's an unarmored opponent, what type of armor it is really. You have this end, which would definitely be very effective at damaging plate. So there are certain weapons that are just objectively better, just if you look at damage, just pure damage output. This basically does it all. Damage is not the only thing that matters, of course. A weapon like this longsword is going to be more versatile, it's going to be way more nimble, and you're just going to be more effective with it in terms of both offense and defense, because you can be quicker, you can cover yourself better with a parry, you have more reach, especially for a thrust, but also for cuts. So as usual, the real world is very complex, and that's part of the appeal of fantasy, fiction, role-playing games, to have something that's a little simpler. You don't have to deal with all the headaches of the real world. Just you can condense it down to simple things. Now, this is the attack value, this is the armor rating. Just roll the dice once and you're done. I'm actually against overcomplicating things in role-playing systems personally. We tried to make a system way back in, I don't know, around 2003, 4, something like that, and actually tried to incorporate things like damage types to make it a little closer to reality. But frankly, from that experience, I would say make it simple. Just don't try to introduce too much realism in the game, because it'll just make it too tedious. You'll end up with lots of tables and having to look up things over and over again and have to roll 150 times. If you're into that, I mean, if you're the kind of person who really likes to puzzle out the fine details and who likes to spend several hours on just one fight or just one round of a fight, and by all means, but I think it's, in this case, actually better to keep things simple. Anyway, it's enough rambling. Hope you found it entertaining. Thanks for watching. Check out the links in the video description down below, and have a good one, folks. Game on.